So we need to talk about a significant case that was recently granted Supreme Court review. This case attempts to build off of a prior 9-0 unanimous decision by the Supreme Court, which impacts your right to prevent the unreasonable search and seizure of firearms within your home without a warrant. So let's break down what is happening in this critical case. Now, real quick, if you're watching this channel, then obviously it's safe to say that you care about the Second Amendment and your rights. Now, here's the thing, even law-abiding gun owners are ending up in jail because they make a bunch of critical mistakes. And those are mistakes that you don't even realize that you're making or that you don't understand that they're illegal. So I put together a free resource called the Legal Survival Guide. It's aimed to help you guys avoid all of those traps that maybe you could fall in. It takes about 2 minutes to read. It's just a simple PDF, and it really could save you years behind bars. I made it to help you guys, again, completely free to download using the link down below. It's just something that I wanted to provide you guys for free so that you can have it in your phone or maybe print it out. And there's a little card also in there that you can put in your wallet to give you additional resources to help you in situations. Obviously, not meant to be legal advice. I'm not your attorney. This isn't an attorney-client relationship, but I wanted to provide you guys some free resources to prevent you falling in some bad situations. Again, if you're interested, click the links down below. It's completely free to do. All you have to do is enter your email to get that free PDF. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a new Supreme Court case that was recently granted review, and it involves when police officers can enter your home without a warrant. This new challenge pending in front of the Supreme Court is called Case versus Montana. This new lawsuit should be on everybody's mind because especially it involves when law enforcement can use legal workarounds to not only enter your home without a warrant, but also potentially confiscate firearms without a warrant. This new case is trying to use and expand upon a prior 9-0 unanimous decision by the Supreme Court in a case called Caniglia versus Strom. In Caniglia, the Supreme Court found that the community caretaking exception to the Fourth Amendment's warrant requirement does not extend to the home. Justice Thomas authored that opinion, and they held that police officers and them seizing Mr. Caniglia's guns was in fact a violation of the Fourth Amendment, and it was against his right against the warrantless search and seizure of firearms, especially within his home. This challenge, Case versus Montana, attempts to use and expand upon that prior ruling. And the Supreme Court recently granted review to this case, and so now they're going to review and decide this issue. Now, the facts around this challenge are very interesting. It's not the best, fact pattern at all, but we've seen the Supreme Court still issue good decisions despite there being kind of bad facts. This lawsuit results from Mr. Trevor Case and his ex-girlfriend, calling the police on him, saying that he was threatening to harm himself and that maybe he also had a firearm. Police officers responded to the call, sat outside his home, I believe, for about 40 minutes, and then eventually entered the home based on their claim being that there was an emergency, that he potentially had a firearm, and that maybe he wanted to harm himself. But they did sit outside of his home for about 40 minutes, but they did eventually decide to go into the home. Now, during this interaction, once entering the home, one of the police officers believed that they saw a shadow and maybe that he was reaching for something. And eventually, I believe Mr. Trevor Case was shot. Now, after that, they did search the home and I believe they found a firearm within a hamper. He was eventually charged and convicted of assaulting an officer as well during this incident. And Mr. Case argued that the police officer's warrantless entry into his home violated the Fourth Amendment. So the firearm that was also found in other evidence should actually be suppressed. Those arguments were then rejected by the lower court, but eventually this challenge made its way to the Montana Supreme Court. The Montana Supreme Court on review affirmed the denial of the motion to suppress the evidence, and that was issued in a 4-3 ruling. In that ruling, they adopted the standard that requires police officers to have an objectively reasonable belief that there is an emergency before aiding someone without a warrant. This standard is substantially less than a showing of probable cause, and that is part of the dispute here. Mr. Case argues that the police officer should have to meet a higher standard of review. Mr. Case argues that the police officers lacked exigent circumstances for entering his home and that the federal emergency aid exception did not actually apply here. He argues that the facts objectively reflected no ongoing emergency requiring immediate action from the Supreme Court. Mr. Case argues that the police officers waited outside his home for about 40 minutes before they decided to enter, so how could there be an emergency if they sat outside his home for 40 minutes? Mr. Case also argued that the search was not justified under the community caretaking doctrine, which was struck down by the Supreme Court in Caniglia versus Strom. Montana argued in contrast that the objectively reasonable basis test amounts actually to probable cause in practice, and that the split here and that the argument here is really more semantic than actually substantive, and that they're essentially still the same thing. Now, one of the big things in this challenge of Mr. Case and his attorneys cite to the 9-0 unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court in Caniglia as support for their position. They state that this case gives the court the opportunity to clarify the contours of the exigent circumstances doctrine as applied to emergency aid situations, an issue that has consistently confused and divided the lower courts since Caniglia was decided. They go on to argue that the court should take this case to resolve the standard for warrantless home entries under the emergency aid exception. Mr. Case argues that after Caniglia, many lower courts have been confused about how to apply that standard, and instead they just apply kind of a de facto or exigent circumstances analysis, and so they really don't know what to do with the Supreme Court Caniglia case, so they just apply something else. Now, if you're not aware of what happened in that Caniglia case, which was 9-0 unanimous in the Supreme Court, essentially in that challenge, one night during an argument with his wife, Mr. Caniglia got a handgun out, put it on the dining room table, and just said to his wife, I believe shouted to her, "Why don't you just take the gun, shoot me, and get it over with?" The wife, of course, was concerned about that conduct, so she decided to leave the home. She stayed at a hotel overnight. When she woke up the next morning, she tried to call her husband. He didn't answer. She was worried about him, so she also called police. She then went to the house with, police officers, and that next morning, they found Mr. Caniglia just essentially on his front porch. Nothing was wrong. However, police officers were still concerned about him, so they decided to take him by ambulance for a psychiatric hold. They wanted to do tests on him, check him out, and so they decided to take him out of the home. Mr. Caniglia, during this interaction with law enforcement, did say that he did not want them to take his firearms. He did not consent to them taking his firearms, and police officers agreed that, yes, they would not take any of those guns. However, after he left the home, after he was taken by the ambulance for psychiatric evaluation, police officers then, talked to his wife, told her that Mr. Caniglia, her husband, said that they could take the firearms, so they essentially lied to her, and she said, okay, well, if my husband said you can take the guns, well, then I'm going to let you take the guns. So police officers entered the home and took 2 handguns, and eventually this sprung into a huge dispute about the warrantless entry into the home and the confiscation of those firearms. And this case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court back in 2021. And on review, the Supreme Court issued a rare 9-0 unanimous ruling, and that decision was in favor of Mr. Caniglia. That majority opinion was written by Justice Thomas, and in that opinion, Thomas stated that the Fourth Amendment protects the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against the unreasonable search and seizure. The very core of this guarantee is the right of a man to retreat into his home and there be free from unreasonable governmental intrusion. Justice Thomas therefore found what is reasonable for vehicles is different from what is reasonable for homes. And based on that, the Supreme Court issued that unanimous ruling in favor of Mr. Caniglia. The Supreme Court has not considered these circumstances when police can enter a home since 2021 without a warrant in these type of exigent circumstances, or, while police officers are, doing community caretaking functions, or when there is some sort of emergency aid exception. They have not addressed any of this since 2021. And now there's a case back in front of them seeking that type of expansion and review in light of Caniglia. This, case challenge is in front of the Supreme Court, and they have decided to grant review to this challenge. This is important because it impacts everyone's protection against these types of warrant exceptions, these emergency aid exceptions, or community caretaking functions. And the parties will now submit additional briefs to the Supreme Court, for their next term. And essentially the next term, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in this case and then rule on this issue before the end of this term. The Supreme Court now has an opportunity to clarify or expand upon that unanimous ruling in Caniglia, which can have direct downstream implications and essentially impact what protections we all have from police officers in certain exceptions to the warrant requirement, like emergency aid exceptions or this community caretaking function. When do they potentially have the ability to enter the home based on emergency basis and not really need those warrants, and potentially also confiscate firearms like they did in the Mr. Caniglia case. So this is a case we're going to be watching closely to see how the Supreme Court handles this. Again, not directly dealing with the 2A, but involves other significant fundamental rights under the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, warrantless entry into the home, what type of exceptions apply, and potentially when could law enforcement enter your home, confiscate firearms without a warrant. So this is a case we're going to be watching very closely. As we get more information, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to simply subscribe to the channel. Also, you can check out my free legal guide. You can get that using the link down below. All you have to do is put in your email and then you get a free PDF. And then we also send you some follow-up emails with additional free educational information, to just help you guys understand some things that are going on. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.